The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Sarah Thompson's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m. She rolled over in her small studio apartment, her hand automatically reaching for the phone to silence it. The 26-year-old waitress had been following this same routine for the past 2 years, but it never got easier. Sarah's tiny apartment sat above a noisy convenience store in Chicago's South Side. The rent wasn't cheap, but it was all she could afford on a waitress's salary. As she got ready for another long day, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her dark brown skin looked tired under the harsh fluorescent lights, and she quickly tied her curly hair into a neat bun, the same hairstyle her mother had taught her years ago. By 5:15 a.m., Sarah was walking the 6 blocks to Jerry's diner, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Her black non-slip shoes, bought from the discount store, clicked against the sidewalk. She had 2 other pairs just like them in her closet. A waitress could never have too many comfortable shoes. The diner's kitchen lights were already on when she arrived. Through the window, she could see Big Mike, the cook, preparing for the morning rush. He was a large man with a kind smile who had been working at Jerry's for over 20 years. The smell of bacon and coffee greeted Sarah as she used her key to enter through the back door. "Morning, baby girl," Big Mike called out as she hung up her coat. "Ready for another day of feeding the masses?" Sarah managed a tired smile. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mike." She went through her opening routine mechanically, wiping down tables, filling salt and pepper shakers, checking the sugar dispensers. Her mind wandered to the business degree hanging on her apartment wall, the one she worked so hard for at Chicago State University. It had been 2 years since graduation, and despite sending out hundreds of applications, she was still stuck waiting tables. The morning regulars started trickling in around 6 a.m. There was Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who always ordered the same breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee. Following him was Mrs. Rodriguez, a high school teacher who graded papers while eating her oatmeal. Sarah knew all their orders by heart. "How's that job search going, honey?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked as Sarah poured her coffee. "Still looking for something in business?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice cheerful. "Something will come up eventually." What Sarah didn't tell Mrs. Rodriguez was how discouraged she felt. Last night, she received another rejection email from a company she'd interviewed with. The words, "We decided to go with a more experienced candidate," still stung. As the morning rush picked up, Sarah moved efficiently between tables, balancing plates, and refilling coffee cups. Her mother had always told her that any honest work was dignified work, but some days were harder than others, especially when customers treated her like she was invisible or complained about their eggs being too runny. During a brief break, Sarah checked her phone. There was a missed call from her mother, Patricia. She'd have to call back later. Their conversations had been tense lately. Patricia kept pushing her to move back home to save money, but Sarah was determined to make it on her own. The breakfast rush finally slowed around 10 a.m. Sarah's feet were already aching, and she still had another 6 hours to go. As she wiped down a recently vacated booth, she found a $5 tip on a $30 check. She sighed, tucking the money into her apron pocket. Every dollar counted when rent was due next week. Looking around the diner, Sarah noticed the usual mix of customers: tired workers grabbing coffee, elderly couples sharing breakfast, and students from the nearby community college hunched over their laptops. She'd served thousands of people over the past 2 years, but she never imagined that one of them would soon change her life forever. Near the end of her morning shift, Sarah caught her reflection in the diner's window. She looked just like her mother, same high cheekbones, same determined set of the jaw, but sometimes when she looked closely, she wondered if she had features from her father too. Not that she'd ever know. Her mother never spoke about him, and Sarah had stopped asking years ago. The lunch crowd would be arriving soon. Sarah straightened her name tag, checked her apron for stains, and grabbed her order pad. Another rush, another few hours on her feet, another day of chasing a dream that seemed to be getting further away. Little did she know, her life was about to take an unexpected turn. It was Tuesday afternoon when Sarah first noticed him. The mysterious man walked into Jerry's diner at exactly 1:15 p.m., dressed in an expensive dark blue suit that stood out among the usual lunch crowd of construction workers and office employees. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone important. Sarah was busy refilling coffee cups when Jenny, another waitress, nudged her. Table 7's in your section, Jenny whispered. And he looks like he's got money. Walking over to table 7, Sarah pulled out her notepad. The man looked up at her, and for a moment, he seemed frozen. His fork clattered against his plate, drawing curious looks from nearby customers. Sarah noticed his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. "Welcome to Jerry's," Sarah said with her usual friendly smile. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man cleared his throat. "Just coffee, please. Black." His voice was deep and smooth, like a radio announcer's, but there was something else in his tone, a hint of emotion Sarah couldn't quite place. Throughout his meal, Sarah caught him watching her, not in the creepy way some customers did, but with an intense curiosity that made her slightly uncomfortable. Every time she walked past his table, his dark eyes followed her movements. He ordered a simple chicken sandwich but barely touched it. "Everything okay with your meal, sir?" Sarah asked when she noticed his barely eaten food. Yes, everything's fine," he replied quickly. "Tell me, how long have you worked here?" The question surprised her. Customers rarely asked personal questions unless they were being nosy or flirting, but this felt different. "About 2 years now," she answered carefully. He nodded slowly, as if this information was somehow important. When he left, he tipped her $50 on a $15 check. Sarah tried to return it, thinking it was a mistake, but he had already walked out the door. The next day, at exactly 1:15 p.m., the man returned. He sat in the same booth, ordered the same coffee, and watched Sarah with the same intense gaze. This time, he asked her about her name. "Sarah Thompson," she told him, wondering why such a simple piece of information made his hand shake as he wrote something in a small notebook. Big Mike noticed the man too. "That's the 3rd day in a row he's come in," he said to Sarah as she picked up an order. "And he ain't here for the food. He keeps watching you like he's seen a ghost." Sarah had noticed. Each day, the well-dressed man would arrive at precisely the same time, sit in her section, and order coffee. Sometimes he'd get food, but he never ate much of it. Instead, he'd ask her small questions about her age, where she grew up, if she went to college. By Friday, even the regular customers had noticed. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside after the man left. "Be careful, honey," she warned. "Rich men don't usually come to diners like this 5 days in a row unless they want something." Sarah was starting to feel nervous about the situation. She thought about asking Jerry, the diner's owner, to switch her section, but curiosity kept her from doing it. There was something familiar about the man's face, something she couldn't quite place. On his 6th visit, Sarah noticed him staring at her hands as she poured his coffee. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" she finally asked, her patience wearing thin. "You've been coming here all week, and I can't help but feel there's a reason." The man set down his coffee cup carefully. His hands were steady now, and his eyes held a mix of fear and determination. "Yes, Sarah, there is something." He reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out an old photograph. I believe we need to talk." Sarah's heart started beating faster. She didn't know why, but something told her this moment was important. The lunch rush was in full swing around them, dishes clattering and customers chatting, but everything seemed to fade into the background as the man held out the photograph. "My name is James Richardson," he said softly, "and I've been looking for you for a very long time." Sarah looked at the photograph in his trembling hands, and her world suddenly stopped spinning. In the faded picture was a young woman she recognized immediately, her mother, Patricia, 27 years younger, standing next to a younger version of the man sitting before her. Sarah stared at the old photograph, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. The busy diner around her seemed to fade away. In the picture, her mother looked young and happy, wearing a yellow sundress, her arm wrapped around a younger version of the man sitting before her. "Jenny, can you cover my tables?" Sarah called out to her coworker, her voice trembling. Jenny nodded, looking concerned as Sarah sat down across from James Richardson. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, still holding the photograph. "How do you know my mother?" James Richardson took a deep breath. His expensive suit suddenly seemed too tight around his neck, and he loosened his tie slightly. "Patricia and I met in the summer of 1997, he began. "We were both young. I was just starting my first real estate project, and she was working at the bank that gave me my first loan." Sarah did the math quickly in her head. 1997, That was the year before she was born. I built shopping malls, office buildings, and luxury apartments across 3 states. James continued, his voice getting softer. I'm worth over $50 million now, but 27 years ago, I was just a young man with big dreams and a small loan. He paused, pulling out another photograph. This was taken the day your mother told me she was leaving Chicago for a job in Detroit. What she didn't tell me was that she was pregnant. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Are you saying? She couldn't finish the sentence. I'm your father, Sarah, James said quietly. I didn't know about you until 5 years ago, when I was going through my mother's old things after she passed away. I found more pictures of Patricia, and something made me hire a private investigator. Tears started rolling down Sarah's cheeks. A few customers were staring now, but she didn't care. 5 years? She asked, her voice breaking. You've known about me for 5 years, and you're just showing up now. James reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder. I've been trying to find the right way to approach you. The investigator gave me regular updates about your life. I know you graduated from Chicago State with a business degree. I know you've been sending out job applications. I know you work double shifts here sometimes to make rent. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. You've been watching me struggle while sitting on millions. I was afraid, James admitted, his own eyes getting wet. I didn't know how to walk into your life after 26 years. I was scared you'd hate me, or think I only found you because of guilt or obligation. He pulled out a business card and placed it on the table. Richardson Development Group. I built it from nothing. And now I want to tell you everything, if you'll let me. Big Mike appeared at their table, concern written all over his face. Everything okay here, Sarah? He asked, eyeing James suspiciously. Sarah wiped her eyes. I need to take my break now, Mike. Can you tell Jerry? For the next hour, in a quiet booth at the back of Jerry's diner, James Richardson told Sarah his story. He described growing up poor on Chicago's South Side, not far from where she lived now. He talked about working 3 jobs to put himself through college, about his first real estate deal, about building his company from scratch. Your grandmother, my mother. She would have loved you, he said, showing Sarah a picture of an elegant older woman. She always wanted grandchildren. She passed away never knowing she had one. Sarah looked at her father. It felt strange even thinking that word, and saw pieces of herself in his face. They had the same shaped eyes, the same way of tilting their head when thinking. Does my mother know you found me? Sarah asked finally. James shook his head. I wanted to tell you first, but I think it's time we all talked. As their conversation wound down, Sarah glanced at the clock and realized her break had ended long ago. Her regular customers were probably wondering where she was, and her other tables needed attention. I have to get back to work, she said, standing up slowly. Of course, James said, also rising. He pulled out a pen and wrote a number on the back of his business card. This is my personal cell. Call me anytime, day or night. I've missed 26 years of your life, Sarah. I don't want to miss any more. Sarah watched him walk out of the diner, his card feeling heavy in her pocket. She tied her apron back on, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her whole life had changed in the span of a lunch break, and she had a feeling this was just the beginning. That evening, after her shift ended, Sarah sat in her small apartment staring at James Richardson's business card. Her phone showed 15 missed calls from her mother. News traveled fast in the diner, and Sarah was sure someone had already told Patricia about the well-dressed man who had turned her daughter's world upside down. At exactly 9:30 p.m., Sarah's apartment buzzer rang. She knew who it was before answering. Her mother always showed up when Sarah ignored her calls. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pressed the button to let her in. Patricia Thompson burst into the apartment still wearing her bank teller uniform, her face showing a mix of anger and fear. Tell me it's not true, she said, dropping her purse on Sarah's small kitchen counter. Jenny's cousin works at the salon next to the bank. She said James Richardson was at the diner today. Sarah pulled out the old photograph and placed it on the counter. Her mother's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at her younger self with James. Why, Mom? Sarah asked quietly. Why didn't you ever tell him about me? Patricia sank into Sarah's only kitchen chair, suddenly looking very tired. You'd have to understand what it was like back then, she began. James was just starting to make it big in real estate. His first project was taking off, and everyone was talking about him being the next big success story. Sarah sat on her bed, which doubled as her living room couch in the tiny studio apartment. So you didn't tell him because he was becoming successful? I told myself I was protecting both of us, Patricia continued, wiping her eyes. I saw how hungry he was for success, how focused he was on his business. The night I found out I was pregnant, he had just signed the contract for his second development project. He talked for hours about his plans, his dreams of building an empire. That should have been my choice too, Mom, Sarah said, her voice cracking. He had a right to know about me, and I had a right to know about him. Patricia stood up and walked to Sarah's window, looking out at the city lights. I was proud, Sarah, too proud. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought he might offer to marry me out of obligation. I didn't want that. I didn't want people thinking I was trying to trap a rising star. So I took that job in Detroit, had you, and convinced myself I was doing the right thing. Sarah thought about all the times she asked about her father growing up. Her mother had always said he wasn't in the picture, making it sound like he'd abandoned them. You let me believe he didn't want me, she said softly. It was easier than admitting I was scared, Patricia replied. By the time I realized my mistake, James was in all the business magazines. Richardson Development Group was worth millions. How could I walk into his office with a teenage daughter and explain what I'd done? Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the browser. She typed, James Richardson, Chicago developer, and dozens of articles appeared. There he was, her father, cutting ribbons at building openings, shaking hands with mayors, standing in front of gleaming skyscrapers. He's been looking for me for 5 years, Mom, Sarah said, showing her mother the phone. He hired a private investigator. He knew about my degree, about this job, about everything. He watched me struggle because he was afraid I'd reject him, just like you were afraid he'd reject us. Patricia's shoulders slumped. We both made mistakes based on fear, she whispered. I was so determined to prove I could raise you on my own that I never stopped to think about what you might want. Sarah looked around her tiny apartment, thinking about all the double shifts she'd worked, all the job rejections she'd faced, all the times she felt alone. He wants to meet with both of us, she told her mother. He thinks it's time we all talked. Patricia nodded slowly, picking up the old photograph again. I guess we have 26 years of conversations to catch up on. Outside, the city continued its nighttime bustle, but in Sarah's small apartment, mother and daughter sat in silence, both lost in thoughts of what could have been and what might still be. The truth had finally come out, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning of a very complicated story. The next few days at Jerry's diner felt like a dream to Sarah. She moved between tables like a robot, taking orders and filling coffee cups, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Twice she brought customers the wrong orders, something she'd never done before in her 2 years of working there. Girl, you need to take some time off, Big Mike told her on Friday morning, after she almost poured coffee into a customer's water glass. Your head ain't been right since that man showed up. But Sarah couldn't afford to take time off. Her rent was due next week, and her bank account was already running low. Even with this life-changing discovery, bills still needed to be paid. During her afternoon break, she sat in the back alley behind the diner, holding James Richardson's business card. She'd looked up his company online and found articles about his latest project, a 40-story luxury apartment building downtown. The man she'd been serving coffee to was worth millions, and he was her father. Her phone buzzed with another text from him. Sarah, I'd like to take you and your mother to dinner tonight. Please say yes, there's so much more to talk about. She hadn't responded to any of his messages yet. Everything felt too overwhelming. Her coworkers kept giving her concerned looks, and the regular customers had noticed something was wrong. Mrs. Rodriguez had even brought her a homemade chocolate cake, saying, "Sweet things help when life gets complicated." Back inside the diner, Jenny cornered her by the coffee maker. So, is it true? She whispered. Is he really your father? The guy who built half of downtown Chicago? Sarah just nodded, not wanting to talk about it. But news traveled fast in a small diner. By lunchtime, even Jerry, the owner, had heard the story. He called Sarah into his small office during the afternoon lull. Listen, kid, Jerry said, leaning back in his squeaky chair. I've owned this place for 30 years. Seen all kinds of family drama play out right here in these booths. But this, he shook his head. This is something else. Sarah played with her apron strings nervously. I don't know what to do, Jerry. Everything's different now, but also exactly the same. I still have bills to pay, still need this job. Jerry's expression softened. Take next week off, he said. Paid leave. Figure things out with your family. Your job will be here when you get back, if you still want it. That evening, Sarah finally looked at the stack of papers James had left her. There were newspaper clippings about his success, old photographs, and even a copy of her birth certificate that his private investigator had found. Her hands trembled as she read through everything. Her phone rang. It was her mother again. They hadn't spoken much since their confrontation 2 days ago. Have you decided about dinner? Patricia asked when Sarah answered. James called me too. He wants to meet at Gibson's Steakhouse. Sarah's stomach turned. Gibson's was one of the most expensive restaurants in Chicago. She walked past it many times but never dreamed of eating there. I don't have anything nice enough to wear to a place like that, she said quietly. I could help you shop for something, her mother offered. I have some savings. No, Sarah interrupted. I can't pretend to be something I'm not. If he wants to talk, he can come back to the diner. Later that night, Sarah finally replied to James's text, the diner. Sunday morning at 9. We can talk there. His response came immediately. I'll be there. Thank you, Sarah. As she got ready for bed, Sarah caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She saw her mother's cheekbones, but now she also recognized James's eyes looking back at her. Her whole life, she'd thought half of her story was missing. Now she had all the pieces, but she didn't know how they fit together. Setting her alarm for another early morning shift, Sarah thought about how strange life was. A week ago, she was just a waitress trying to make ends meet. Now she was the daughter of one of Chicago's wealthiest developers. But tomorrow, she'd still put on her uniform, tie her hair back, and serve coffee to the morning regulars. Some things hadn't changed, at least not yet. Sunday morning arrived with a light drizzle coating Chicago's streets. Sarah got to Jerry's diner early, even though it was supposed to be her day off. She wanted everything to feel normal when James arrived, so she put on her uniform anyway and helped set up for the morning rush. At exactly 9 a.m., 2 vehicles pulled up outside the diner. One was her mother's old Honda Civic, and the other was James's sleek black Mercedes. Sarah watched through the window as they both got out of their cars, awkwardly avoiding eye contact with each other. You sure you want to work during this? Big Mike asked from the kitchen window, watching Sarah tie her apron. I need to keep my hands busy, she replied. It helps me think. The bell above the door chimed as James and Patricia walked in. Sarah had asked Jerry to reserve the corner booth, the quietest spot in the diner. As they sat down, Sarah noticed how her mother smoothed her dress nervously while James kept adjusting his tie. Coffee? Sarah asked, approaching their table with a pot in hand, trying to act normal even though her heart was racing. Sarah, please sit down, James said gently. You don't need to serve us today. She poured 3 cups of coffee anyway before sliding into the booth next to her mother. For a moment, nobody spoke. The usual Sunday morning sounds of the diner, clinking plates, sizzling bacon, customer chatter, filled the awkward silence. Finally, James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I want to show you both something, he said, spreading several papers on the table. They were architectural drawings of buildings, tall, gleaming structures that touched the sky. These are all the buildings I've built over the last 26 years, he explained. Each one represents a dream I had, a goal I achieved. He paused, looking directly at Sarah, but sitting here now, I realize I was building the wrong things. I should have been building relationships instead of just buildings. Patricia's hand found Sarah's under the table and squeezed it. James, she began, I know I made a huge mistake not telling you about Sarah. I was young and proud and scared. We were all young, James interrupted softly, and we all made mistakes, but Sarah shouldn't have to pay for them anymore. He pulled out another document from his briefcase. I've set up a trust fund in your name, he told Sarah. It's yours, no strings attached, enough money that you'll never have to worry about rent or bills again. Sarah felt her throat tighten. I don't want your money, she said quietly but firmly. I want to know my father. I want to understand where I come from. Money can't fix 26 years of not knowing. James's eyes filled with tears. The The first time Sarah had seen him cry. "Then let me tell you everything," he said. "About my childhood in the South Side, about my parents, about how I built my company from nothing. Let me tell you about your grandmother, who loved to cook Sunday dinners for the whole neighborhood. Let me share all the stories you should have grown up hearing." For the next 2 hours, as the morning rush came and went around them, James told stories about his life. He talked about growing up poor, about working 3 jobs to pay for college, about his first real estate deal. Sarah learned that she got her love for numbers from him, her determination from both parents. "You have your grandmother's smile," James said, showing them an old photo of his mother. "And her business sense, too. She ran a small grocery store that kept our whole family fed." As they talked, other memories surfaced. Patricia shared stories about Sarah's childhood that James had missed. Her first steps, her first day of school, her high school graduation. With each story, the gap of 26 years began to feel a little less wide. "I can't change the past," James said finally, "but I want to be part of your future, Sarah. Not just as someone who can provide financial support, but as your father, if you'll let me." Sarah looked at her parents, her mother, who had raised her alone out of pride and fear, and her father, who had built an empire but missed his daughter's whole life. They were all broken in different ways, but maybe, she thought, broken things could be rebuilt. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But we take it slow, day by day, just like serving coffee, 1 cup at a time." Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life began to change in small but significant ways. She still worked her regular shifts at Jerry's diner, but now James would stop by every morning for breakfast. He'd sit at the counter, drinking his coffee and watching her work with a mixture of pride and regret in his eyes. One quiet Tuesday morning, as Sarah refilled his coffee cup, James asked her an unexpected question. "Would you like to see where I work?" That afternoon, Sarah stood in front of the Richardson Development Group building, a 40-story glass tower that seemed to touch the clouds. She felt out of place in her waitress uniform, but James had insisted on bringing her straight from her shift. "This all started in a tiny office with just me and a dream," James said as they rode the elevator to the top floor. "Now we employ over 300 people. The elevator doors opened to reveal a busy office floor. People rushed around with papers and laptops, but everyone stopped to stare when James walked in with Sarah. She could hear whispers following them. Everyone knew about the boss's newly discovered daughter. "And this," James said, opening a door, "is where I spend most of my days." His office was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Chicago. Family photos covered one wall, pictures of his parents, his siblings, and now, in the center, a new photo of Sarah that he'd taken at the diner. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a large conference room. The table was covered with blueprints and documents. "This is our newest project, a community development on the South Side. Affordable housing, a shopping center, and a job training facility." Sarah looked at the plans with interest. Numbers and calculations caught her eye: budgets, projections, profit margins. Without thinking, she pointed to one section. "These operating costs seem high," she said. "Couldn't you reduce them by using solar panels? The initial investment would be higher, but the long-term savings." James watched her with a growing smile. "You have good instincts," he said proudly. "Just like your grandmother. She could look at a business plan and spot problems immediately." Later that evening, Sarah's mother came to the diner during the dinner rush. Patricia had been making an effort to repair their relationship too, showing up with old photo albums and sharing stories about Sarah's childhood that she'd never told before. "I saw you went to your father's office today," Patricia said, sitting at the counter. "How was it?" Sarah poured her mother a cup of coffee. "It was overwhelming. All those people working for him, that huge building with his name on it." She paused, wiping down the counter. "But you know what felt strange? Some of it actually made sense to me. The business part, the numbers, the planning. It was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." Patricia reached across the counter and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You're so much like him," she said softly. "I see it more every day. The way you analyze things, your determination. I was wrong to keep you two apart for so long." That night, after her shift, Sarah found James waiting in the parking lot. He'd started driving her home sometimes, using the car rides to share more family stories. "I've been thinking," he said as they drove through the city streets. "That project I showed you today, would you be interested in being part of it? Not because you're my daughter, but because you have good business sense. You could start as a project coordinator, learn the business from the ground up." Sarah thought about it. She'd been sending out job applications for 2 years with no luck. Now her father was offering her a chance to use her business degree, to learn from him, to be part of something bigger. "I'll think about it," she said carefully. "But if I do this, I want to earn it. No special treatment." James smiled. Just like your grandmother. She never took the easy way either. As they pulled up to her apartment building, Sarah looked at her father. In just a few weeks, they'd gone from strangers to family. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, still hurts to heal. But they were building something new, one day at a time. "Same time tomorrow morning?" she asked. "Your usual coffee and wheat toast." "Wouldn't miss it," James replied. "After all, I have 26 years of breakfasts to make up for." 6 months had passed since James Richardson first walked into Jerry's diner and changed Sarah's life forever. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows as Sarah tied her apron for what would be her last regular shift. "Can't believe you're really leaving us," Big Mike said, his voice thick with emotion as he flipped pancakes on the grill. "Who's going to keep me company during these early morning shifts?" Sarah smiled, fighting back tears. The diner had been her second home for over 2 years. Even after starting her new job at Richardson Development Group 3 months ago, she kept working weekend shifts. But now it was time to move forward. "You sure about this?" Jerry asked, watching her set up for the morning rush one last time. "Your father's offer is good, but you'll always have a place here." Sarah nodded. Yesterday, James had made her an official proposal, a full-time position as project manager for the Southside Development. She'd earned it too, spending every free moment learning the business, studying real estate development, and contributing valuable ideas to the project. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 6 a.m. Sarah turned to see both her parents walking in together, something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. James wore his usual business suit, but Patricia had dressed up in her best outfit, even though she had to work at the bank later. "Ready for your last day?" Patricia asked, hugging her daughter. "Almost," Sarah replied. "Just need to serve my regular customers one more time." As if on cue, the morning regulars started arriving. Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Rodriguez, and all the others who'd been part of her daily life for so long. Word had gotten around that it was Sarah's last day, and everyone wanted to say goodbye. "Look at you," Mrs. Rodriguez said proudly, "from serving coffee to managing million-dollar projects, but you never let success change you. Stayed right here serving us until you were ready." During a quiet moment, Sarah found herself alone with her father at the counter. James sipped his coffee, black, no sugar, just like every morning for the past 6 months. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I first walked in here looking for you, I was terrified. I thought you might hate me, or just want my money. Instead, you taught me something important." "What's that?" Sarah asked, refilling his cup one last time. "That success isn't just about building things, it's about building relationships." He looked around the diner. "You built something special here. Connections, trust, community. That's what I want our new project to be about too." The Southside development was taking shape, incorporating many of Sarah's suggestions. They'd added a community center, expanded the job training facilities, and partnered with local businesses. It wasn't just about making money, it was about making a difference. Near the end of her shift, the entire diner staff gathered around. Jerry brought out a cake that Big Mike had baked specially. Even Jenny, who had the day off, came in to say goodbye. "Speech," someone called out, and Sarah found herself standing in front of everyone who'd been part of her journey. 2 years ago, she began, her voice shaking slightly, "I was just a college graduate who couldn't find a job. This place became my home, and you all became my family. Finding my father changed my life, but this diner changed me first. It taught me about hard work, about treating people with respect, about building community one cup of coffee at a time." Patricia wiped tears from her eyes as James put an arm around her shoulders. Another small miracle of healing. They'd all come so far from that first awkward meeting in the corner booth. At exactly 2 p.m., Sarah untied her apron for the last time. She hung it on the hook where it had lived for 2 years, right next to Big Mike's lucky spatula and Jenny's spare name tag. Don't be a stranger, Jerry said gruffly, giving her a quick hug. Your coffee will always be on the house. As Sarah walked out of Jerry's diner, she felt different. Not because she was leaving, but because she knew she wasn't really saying goodbye. This place, these people, would always be part of her story. She was just adding new chapters now. James waited by his car to drive her to the office, her office now too. But first, Sarah turned for one last look at the diner where everything had changed. Through the window, she could see Big Mike at his grill, Jenny serving coffee, and her mother sitting at the counter. Some things would stay the same, even as life moved forward. Ready? James asked. Sarah smiled, thinking about all the twists and turns that had led to this moment. Ready, she replied. Let's go build something together.